because the electric fence is wonderful when it works, and it's the worst thing when it doesn't.
Galen Gerrish with American Grazing Lands Services is my guest today. They sell a lot of fencing materials all across the country, and today we're going to discuss, he and I, the components that they're finding success in for building permanent electric fence, portable fencing, to Energizers, things like wire, line posts, insulators. Now, maybe you've been thinking about adding this element to your ranch, or you've been doing this for some time. In either case, what you don't want to do is waste money on material or products that's going to fail. That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, your host. Thanks for joining us here on our program today. I want to remind you, if you are listening on the radio and you hear something, you want to go back and listen to it again, pretty simple way to go and find a downloaded version of the program. You can go directly to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or you can find us on any podcast provider out there, say things like Spotify or Apple or Pandora. The list goes on and on. You can find us there if you just search under Working Ranch Radio Show. By the way, be sure you tune in through the rest of the program here today after the interview with Galen, our guest, as we will have meteorologist Don Day in with a look at our long-term weather, and of course the captain, Tim O'Byrne, in for this week's edition of Tim's Two Cents. Well, joining us here on the program is Mr. Galen Gerrish. He is with the American Grazing Lands Services, LLC. They're out of Idaho. And just to give you a little brief history, because we have a lot of stuff to talk about here today about products, Galen and his family live there in Idaho. Jim Gerrish is his dad, grazing expert and consultant that we've had here on our program as well. But they do sell a lot of the products that go into building permanent or portable electric fence. And I thought, in light of all of that and the amount of producers that they talk to and they themselves building and doing their own grazing, this would be a good practical show that we could have and talk about some of the components that go into building permanent and portable electric fence. So Galen, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Happy to be here.
Well, Galen, before we start jumping into looking at the components that you guys are finding being used out there when it comes to building permanent and portable electric fence, I wanted to maybe break the ice a bit here and just talk about where I think a lot of folks start from when it comes to looking at this. Of course, for many of us, barbed wire fences have been around for ages and a long time, and a lot of our places are built that way. Not that we're going to completely go away from that, but at the same time, we might want to bring in a component of putting in smooth wire, electric fence type situations, especially when it comes to breaking up some of our pastures. So from your perspective, as you talk with other folks out there, I know there's initially just that apprehension of where do you get started? And that's got to be one of the first things that we address. So how do you deal with folks that are just maybe kind of dipping their toe in the water or not sure where to get started?
The way that I typically help somebody, just go ahead and put their toes in the water is get an idea of what they're comfortable with. Also tell them the pros and cons of going with a permanent fence setup versus portable. Permanent fence typically has a lower cost to it. It's going to be a little bit more labor intensive to put that in, but it's going to be there and it's going to give you a much stronger power backbone through your property than if you're running a bunch of poly wires that have small conductors that don't push a charge near as far. On 12.5 gauge wire over a mile, there's hardly any resistance there. And so you can really reach out and power a good area of property with high tensile, but you're going to be limited if you choose to just go with portable.
Mm-hmm. Well, Galen, let's take a break here because the next subject I want to get into is looking at the components being used in the building and construction of permanent fencing, as we'll look at wire, posts, insulators, strainers, things like that, what's being used out there, what you're finding is working well. And later on in the show, we'll be talking portable fencing as well. And then, of course, later on, we'll even get into Energizers as well. So stick with us. We'll continue on more here on the Working Ranch Radio Radio Show. While we head to break here, it is a good time to go and refill your coffee cup. It's what I'm going to do. Thanks to Jim and Trish Williams of Cowpuncher Coffee. They keep me taken care of. I kind of like the dark roast blend. That's what I've got. But hey, they've got different varieties, different blends for anything that you might be looking at. Check them out. You can go to their website at cowpunchercoffee.com. Give Jim or Trish a call. Visit with them. They'll get you hooked up. Grab a mug. Let's spur the day with Cowpuncher Coffee. You know, when it comes to agriculture, real estate, there's definitely not a shortage of folks in the business. And for a lot of them, really all they want to do is market your assets. But what there is a shortage of are folks that'll sit down with you, whether it's out in your pickup there in the pasture or across your kitchen table, and bring you a multifaceted approach to the future of your land asset. And yeah, I know while selling might be what you're considering, have you thought about all your options? What about having someone guide you through leasing or maybe ranch management? Wouldn't you want someone with some expertise, experience, and integrity in that business, providing you with the best options that will help you and your family make some big decisions that you're going to feel confident about into the future? Back in 1946, Henry Wall and his son Warren founded Hall Mortgage Company, and now we're 78 years later, and we know them as Hall & Hall. They have become one of the most diverse companies in the country that work in agriculture real estate. With listings throughout the United States and Canada, they're multifaceted in their ability to broker real estate. They can provide long-term financing for buyers, but also they do appraisals, brokerage, or auction services for landowners. But yet, at the end of it, they still have a desire to see land stay in production agriculture, whether it's the current family ranch owners or maybe new buyers. Hall & Hall can assist with things like day-to-day operations to hiring or lease negotiations. Now, I've known and worked with the folks at Hall & Hall for over 25 years, and I trust that they'll guide you through the next steps that you may be considering regarding your ranch operation. If you head to their website at hallandhall.com, not only will you find all the information about the services that they provide, but if you look up there in the corner, you're going to see a phrase that I think speaks volumes about the depth of the company and the people you're going to work with at Hall & Hall. It says, dedicated to the land and landowners since 1946. To find out more, go to their website at hallandhall.com. Well, as we turn back at our subject at hand, joining us on the program is Galen Gerrish with the American Grazing Lands Services. And I had talked a little bit about, in the first segment, all of the things that they do. They sell an awful lot of products to ranchers all across the country. And I felt it was important that we talk with somebody that find out what's working and what's not. We're not out here to endorse necessarily any particular products or companies or anything like that. Just basically have a discussion like we were sitting down at the kitchen table and what that would sound like. So Galen, let's start first as we look at permanent fencing. Let's start first with the wire.
From the permanent standpoint, you have options of typically anywhere from 12.5 gauge wire, 14 gauge, or 16 gauge. I have only ever dealt with 12.5 gauge. Right now, a 4,000 foot of the 12.5 gauge wire, 180 KSI, meaning 180,000 pounds tensile strength. That's going for about $150 a roll. All I've ever really worked with is 12.5 gauge wire. I prefer it for a number of reasons. One, the strength is much greater than if you go with the smaller gauge wire. Just hands down, it's going to take, if a cow runs into it, if a deer jumps into it, even if an elk runs into it, it's going to hold. Same cannot be said for those smaller gauge wires. Another is visibility. A lot of animals won't even see those smaller gauge wire. I know that doesn't apply to everybody's herd, and some people have adapted their herds to run with a smaller gauge wire, but I'd say that that's more of the exception. And then the third reason that I prefer the 12.5 gauge is going back to the first segment, the lower resistance. I can carry 12.5 gauge over thousands of acres with not a whole lot of loss.
Mm-hmm. You do have some different tensile strengths in 12.5 gauge as well. Just talk on that briefly.
Yeah, so I really don't recommend anything under 180 KSI minimum strength. A lot that you will see of, like, say, farm stores would be 170. We'd be like, well, that might be close enough to 180 to get me by. Well, the 170 is actually rated at its max tensile strength. The 180 is at a minimum. So there are several hundred pounds breaking strength different when you compare the two side by side. The lower strength wire tends to have a lot more stretch and sag to it as well. And so it doesn't keep its tension, which is extremely important when it comes to resisting breakage. An under tension fence is much more likely, or for that matter, an over tension fence. An under and over tension fence are both much more likely to break. They lose their breaking strength fairly quickly when you go, for instance, the optimal tension that you should be putting on a high tensile fence that is a smooth wire like this is about half of what you would put on a barbed wire fence. For those that have built barbed wire, you usually tension up to 250 pounds. Electric fencing, you would want to go to about 125 to 150, and that will give you enough tension to, do what the fence needs to do to keep the animals in, to provide that resistance if the animal should push into it, to immediately shock them. A sloppy, saggy fence makes it very easy for an animal to actually push through, and if they have a thick enough coat, to just walk through and not receive a shock.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk then now about posts, because that's something that really might have a little bit more discussion on it, because there's a lot of different options out there for types of posts. What are you seeing that's being used now?
Ideally, you want a post that is going to be, it'll insulate itself, meaning that it is made out of plastic or fiberglass. Dried wood also is, pretty good at insulating. Not that you would ever attach an electrified wire directly to a wood post, but as far as T-posts go, and that's kind of one of the biggest obstacles that we run up against, is a farmer that has a stockpile of T-posts. And in that case, I say buy a high quality insulator. We have a number of T-post insulators on our site that you can look at. The plastic posts that we currently have are the timeless fence posts, and they're a plastic T-post. They have a T profile, and you can get those in several different profile widths, 1.5 inches for your 1 or 2 3-wire fences, and then 1 3/4 inches, which I could take all the way up to like a 7 or even a 9-wire fence. Typically, we're not building fence like that. Up to 4 or 5 for cattle on the perimeter is all we would do. And then for the stronger liner boss posts, that you would insert every 1 to 5, you put one of these posts in for every 4 or 5 of the smaller profile. And this is just to stiffen it up. They have that in the 2 1/8 inch profile, and then they even have some 3.5 inch profiles. And they also make braces, angle and H brace styles. And then going over to fiberglass. Fiberglass has always been a great option. That's what I grew up building fence with back when I was probably about 10 years old. Started with sheep fencing, putting in hedge corners and like 1/2 inch fiberglass posts and about 3 or 4 wires is how we do all those paddocks. We have definitely changed in how we build fence now, but the fiberglass, you can get that pre-drilled, you can get it coated, and you can get it in all kinds of different diameters and profiles. So one of the most economical posts out there for the longest time was the sucker rod, the fiberglass sucker rod. So that is oil field reject sucker rod. They have that in 1 inch diameter, and these are things that you can view at the site as well for those looking to put a picture to what I'm saying here. But yeah, the sucker rod comes in the 1 inch profile and the 1.25 inch. A big benefit of sucker rod on top of its durability, because while they do burr out and they're difficult to handle, I would recommend anybody working with fiberglass to wear glasses and wear leather gloves. Yeah. And if you're ever cutting or drilling, wear a mask. Mm-hmm. That's just safe practice there. They'll last a lifetime.
Yeah, it's what we've used here and have had pretty good luck with those as well. Well, let's take another break here, Galen. When we come back, we're going to continue on. There's some more things we want to talk about when it comes to permanent fencing, some more components that we've yet to talk about, things like insulators, strainers, things like that. In addition, we're going to get into talking portable fencing and later on also Energizers as well. So stick with us. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. To find out more, you can go to their website at gelbvieh.org. We'll be at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and had excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Galen Gerrish with the American Grazing Lands Services, as we're talking about the components being used and what they're finding are being successfully used in building permanent electric fence, and we're going to be talking about portable here in just a moment. Galen, in the last segment we finished up, we were talking a little bit about line posts, as specifically the use of fiberglass is one of the options as well. Is there a certain diameter, though, that we need to be at when it comes to handling larger livestock like many of the ranchers are? Because in my experience, I found with some of that smaller diameter fiberglass posts that it's a little chintzy. So is there a certain diameter that would be the best when handling larger livestock?
Yeah. So if you're going permanent, 1.25 inches and 1 inch is typically what I would want to stick with. There are some smaller diameters with a SunGuard coat. That's actually a trademark name there, the SunGuard. That is a specific white coating that is applied to fiberglass, and they come in ranges of anywhere from like a 3/8 inch rod up to a 7/8, I believe. Mm-hmm. And the 3/8, I would really prefer to keep that with portable fencing only, meaning polywire, polybraid, and not trying to attach any kind of high tensile to it. It's just going to weigh it down. It's going to bend the posts and be pretty sloppy. And fiberglass, for all of its wonders, does not stay in the ground the same way that a plastic post does. So I'm talking when you drive the post into the ground, fiberglass, with a little twist and a pull, it comes right out. Even the larger diameters. There might be some instances where you drive into some sticky clay that you get a pretty good bite, or if you are building permanent fence and you're going through a rock field and you actually have to use a pilot driver or hammer drill to get that in, then those are going to be there. They're not moving. But trying not to get the smallest post, in order to save a buck or two. I'd really rather people, if they're doing high tensile, kind of a rule, if you're doing 1/2 inch, just do up to 2 wires and make sure that you have at least 15 inches in the ground. Mm-hmm. But ideally you're staying with the 1 inch or the 1.25 inches. And the 1.25 inches has, and this matters for us out west here, where a lot of people graze on public land or they themselves own dry ranches. There's always a chance of fire. And if you build all of your fences on wood posts, there's a good chance that when a fire goes through, you're just left with a bunch of wires on the ground. Fiberglass, especially 1.25 inches, is virtually fireproof. I'm sure there's a thermal point at which they are no longer able to withstand, but from what we have seen through rangeland fires, 1.25 inches holds up, where the smaller rods actually will rupture. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Okay, perimeter fencing. What do you recommend for number of wires?
For cattle, you have to look at like what your liabilities are, for one. If you're next to a county road, highway, things like that, or if you're just looking to keep the animals in and feel comfortable about it, a 4-wire is perfect.
Okay. When it comes to posts, as you had talked about, we've got the plastic posts, the fiberglass. Price comes into some of this. I know when folks are first exploring this, they're looking at this and they're thinking pricing. So when it comes to line posts, you had mentioned a bit ago about if there's some old T-posts, steel T-posts that are out there, because one of the things people get I felt like when I first started down this, the people that had built a lot of fence was just really big on absolutely no metal in your fencing. Well, I'm sorry, as a rancher, I've got material on my place that I have and I want to use, and so some of that's gonna be metal. And so when we talk about line posts or even brace posts and things like that, I guess I feel like let's not deter folks from looking at this just because they have metal. And that discussion, let's just you and I have that real quickly about that, because as other ranchers out there, I've got material that I've got 4.5-inch gas line that I want to use to help build my fence a little bit cheaper. Doesn't mean I can't still use it.
Absolutely. Absolutely use it, but educate yourself to where you're not going to create a fail point in the fence, meaning you're not going to create a short, because the electric fence is wonderful when it works and it's the worst thing when it doesn't. It just becomes a suggestion, and you hope that your animals are trained to respect the wire. But for welded corners, like you were saying, whether you're welding an H brace, welding an angle brace, absolutely just use high quality plastics, UV resistant plastics, and look at your electric fence the same way that I would say, look at the wiring in your house. If anybody out there has done that, make sure that you are not creating the chance for a short. Use good quality materials and you'll be just fine.
You bet.
But yeah, I'm all about saving a buck. I think that's really important, and I don't want to discourage anybody from using the resource that they have on hand, but absolutely go with the highest quality material out there for insulation.
Another quick question here, just post spacing. And I know this can vary from the type of topography that you're going across, but just kind of a rule of thumb when it comes to post spacing.
On your perimeter fence, where you have, let's say, up to 5 wires on flat ground, go up to 35 feet in between. And that will create a strong, rigid fence where you're not going to have posts leaning and bending. But also the post depth matters a lot too. So just to touch on that real quick, if you are building a 5-wire fence, then you need to have a minimum of 18 inches of post in the ground. And it doesn't really matter what kind of post you're using. Mm-hmm. So, but then when you're putting in those larger diameter posts for support, like basically what anywhere from about 20% of your fence would be constructed out of, or it could be a little bit less, but those larger posts that actually support the fence, those are going to be spaced about every 250 feet apart in a perimeter fence. Now, if you're doing a subdivision fence with a 1 or a 3 wire, well, 1 wire, you could run that out about 60 feet comfortably. And I know there's people that run it out to 100 feet and they're totally fine with that wire hanging 20 inches above the ground. They start at 36 and in between, it sags down like 22 inches or something. But if you want to build, if you're not trying to stretch the limits, and if you just want to follow a good guideline, 60 feet on the 1 wire, about 50 feet on the 2 wire, 45 feet on the 3 wire. And then when you get into those multi-wire perimeter fencing, don't go further than 35 feet. About 30 to 35 is how, we professionally build a fence for anybody across the country.
Okay. Now let's switch and let's talk about strainers, which is another name for a tightener, a mechanism that can fit in line, various ways or places that can be located based upon the different types that are out there. So let's talk about strainers.
Yes. You have 3 options to work with. One is a wheel tightener, which is a no-cut option, also called a daisy strainer. That is a wheel that you would place anywhere in your fence line and be able to tighten from with a tool or a 1/2-inch drive. And then once you have it to the appropriate tension, you would go ahead and pin it in place. And that's a great, like I said, as a no-cut option, install anywhere along the fence. Strainers, typically you would want to install, as a rule, about every 1/4 of a mile. Now, if you add bends into that, then that changes. You need to account for bends. And going to the daisy, that's actually a very easy way to tighten your fence and put, once the fence is already built, going in and putting in where you're slack. The other strainer options that you would find would be kind of a ratchet style. It almost functions sort of like a come along, where you just tighten it with a handle and it ratchets up. You tighten it about a half inch at a time for each click. And you can put about 6 feet of wire on, if you lay the wire out well on those strainers. And that's a good thing to have, that extra wire, because you never know when something might fail. So, and that is tightened with a special handle as well. Those are, like I said, those are ratchet strainers. And then the other kind of strainer would be your gripple, which is a small multi-purpose splice. So it not only functions as a splice for a fence, but it also functions as a tightener. And once again, that's the gripple. There's several different tools that will tighten the gripple for you, but it is highly advised to use a gripple tightener tool and not try to actually just pull it through with a pair of pliers.
All right, let's take a break here, and when we come back, it'll be our last segment with Galen, but we have got a lot to cover because we've yet to even talk about portable fencing, in addition to Energizers, which is the part that's pretty important in all of this as well. So when we come back, we'll get into those. This segment today brought to you by K-Line Irrigation, a cost-effective, adaptive irrigation solution designed specifically with the grass-based livestock producer in mind. To find out more, you can go to their website at k-linena.com.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Galen Gerrish with the American Grazing Lands Services. Ironically, I was noticing when we went to break in the last segment, it was sponsored by K-Line Irrigation, which incidentally, I know you guys are a dealer for them as well. So if folks have questions, they can talk to you about K-Line Irrigation. But nevertheless, we're talking building permanent portable electric fence, and we've been focusing mainly on permanent and some of the components that go into that. We're going to be talking portable in just a moment, but maybe a bridge into that, Galen, would be to talk about some of the insulators that go on the end posts, on the end of runs and various things like that can be used.
Sure. Starting with the beginning of your fence, there's several ways that you could start that. They're called terminal insulators. And what you want, because you are putting a good deal of tension, ideally about 150 pounds of pull, when you go ahead and you actually tighten up your fence, that's about how much pull you have per wire on the fence. And most insulators are made out of plastic. There's some porcelain ones, but if you're going to use plastic, you need to have a reinforced, there are some insulators that are made with fiberglass, and then there's also insulators that have a metal wire that is put inside the insulator, whether it's just a band, kind of like a metal insert to prevent the wire from cutting through, because that wire is pulling on that insulator 365 days a year. And so that metal will prevent it from eventually working through the insulator and creating an issue. And so a good one that, we've used for, well over 30 years now is called the WN post insulator. And that has everything that you would want in an insulator. It's durable. It has the metal wire insert to prevent the wire, from cutting through. So that's a really good option to choose from. There's also some insulators that make life really easy because it has a strainer built into it. So you start your fence with a strainer and the ability to tighten on both ends. Gallagher makes basically a slip knot insulator where it comes with your terminal wire that would wrap around the post, and then the insulator just goes through that and it tightens up, and then you can stick the lead of your wire into that and tighten it up from that point. Moving on to the line posts, I still have yet to find an insulator that impresses me more than the SpeedRite wood post insulator, whether that's the claw or the pin lock. I prefer the claw just because there's a bit more material there. But the real reason that it impresses me is that even in places like Texas, and that just gets a tremendous amount of heat and sun on it, they hold up. And we actually use these on drill stem pipes. So like 2 7/8 steel walled pipe, and using a self-tapping screw, you can use them on whether it's a composite material, a metal, or a wood post. They just hold up. And as long as your fasteners will hold, that insulator will hold too. And so that's the SpeedRite wood post insulator that we really like. And then going over to T-post, because that is always going to be, something that people are going to look at, because that's sometimes an option. And right now, I have seen T-posts going for less than some of these poly posts, even brand new. But you want an insulator that wraps around or either slides over the post, meaning that you have 360 degrees or at least 3 points of contact on the T-post. So the insulator will fit across the face of the T-post and then hook onto the spine. We don't really use insulators that just clip onto the face, because those, you give it a good yank just with your own strength and you can pop those insulators off fairly easy. Just imagine what, a deer or a cow can do. It wouldn't take much to go off. So we want the insulator to go all the way around the T-post, and that will ensure that the wire is going to stay there.
Okay, let's jump now into portable fencing. We don't have a lot of time here, Galen, but let's talk about portable fencing. This is going to be something, as you talked about in the first segment, more to cross fence, maybe off of some permanent fencing that you have, or maybe some existing barbed wire fence that you have and you want a cross section of fence. Or if you're just starting, you're not sure where you want to put permanent fencing in your ranching operation, and you want to start with some portables, some stuff like that. So let's go there. First would be, of course, like we did with the permanent. Let's start with the wire, because I know there's definitely stuff we want to stay away from, and then the type that you would suggest we use.
Well, if I don't mention it, it's probably not, those are probably the products not worth looking at. The type of poly that we really prefer is a braided type. That means it has a polyester core and polyethylene strands that usually 3 to 5 times stronger than poly wire that has just the polyethylene strands and then the metal in there. So the specific braid that we really like and have used for over 20 years at this point is the PowerFlex poly braid. It is just what I described. It's a cord. It's not a twisted wire or anything like that. It is actually metal conductors running through that. There's 9 conductors, and you have an option to choose between, depending on how far you're going, 9 stainless strands for if we were going to strip graze less than 1/4 mile, then in between high tensile strands. So we're never really running more than 1/4 mile with the 9 stainless. That's what we prefer to use. And then for the longer runs, the mixed metal that has 6 stainless strands with 3 tint copper, and over a mile, I believe it has about 10 times the conductivity of your stainless, because they have the tint copper in there. You don't really see the benefits of that higher conductivity wire until you're actually pushing out, around 1,600 feet. I think is that where you start to see the benefits of the wire. There is another slight difference between the mixed metal and the 9 stainless, though, is that the mixed is slightly thicker and it's going to be a little bit stronger because of that, which typically would mean that you're going to have a longer lifespan. As long as you're not breaking the wire, cutting the wire because you ran the wire off the side of a reel, we're usually seeing about 10 to 15 years lifespan out of each roll of wire, which is a far cry better than what you would get if you were just to run down to the farm store and get like a yellow roll of wire that within a year you can probably break just pulling it too tight, at the end of the line. But yeah, so the PowerFlex poly braid, great product. And then for those that are looking, for high conductivity, but not wanting to occupy as much space on their reels, I've enjoyed the Gallagher Turbo Wire. It's not as heavy, and it has basically the same amount of conductivity as the highest conductor has in the poly braid. So those two are really good options to look at.
Okay. Let's talk line posts. The O'Briens were ones that were step-in posts, were something that you guys have really been high on years ago. Is that still the case? I know there's some other types of step-in posts that seem to be working nowadays that have come on. Let's talk about that just a little bit.
As far as plastic posts go, I'll put out there right now, please don't buy anything that is not an O'Brien. If it's a plastic post, there might be something else out there that you like, you've used, you're happy with, but if you are just starting and you're looking at plastic posts, don't just grab any plastic post that you see. Make sure that it is an O'Brien. There's no post that is even close to comparable to it. The downside of an O'Brien is that because they come with 8 post clips and 4 tape clips, they can get kind of tangled up and they're a little bit big. And so if you're working on foot, around 15 posts is like what you can comfortably carry. If you're getting up into the 20, then you have posts just kind of falling out of your arms the whole time. But if you have the pleasure of working off of an ATV and you can make yourself a post box or purchase, a post rack, then that makes life a whole lot easier. So that's my thoughts on the plastic post. If it's not O'Brien, don't even consider it. Going over to other step-in posts that work well, Gallagher has made an improved version of the pigtail. Everybody's probably seen the white pigtail posts at the farm store, and those are the ones that tangle together and then over, just running poly through it, they'll wear out the insulation because it's kind of a soft plastic that wraps around the pigtail where the wire goes through. Those wear out, and those are the posts that'll shock you. The Gallagher ring tops were an improvement upon the pigtail by putting a molded nylon top on the top of the post, and it doesn't have an actual metal ring that runs through the post. So there's absolutely no chance of shorting out if that wire is through the ring top. It also has more of a closed top to where it doesn't have a wild pigtail sticking out there that can hook 3 other posts. The ring tops, they come in 3 different versions. For those that they have sheep or calves, or they need to throw out some extra wires. Then there's a multi-wire ring top post, and then there's a heavy-duty ring top post that has a larger step, and then they have the original orange top ring top post that, it's pretty easy to carry 25 if you're, once again, working off foot. That's a good long run. And go into the post. We talked about post spacing on permanent posts. Let's talk about post spacing for portable. 45 feet for single wire is a good rule of thumb to follow. I know that you can go out a bit further, and on the pivots, we were going about 60 feet because it worked out perfect. And so figure out what works for you. And when you're designing your fences, like your permanent fences, try to get, somewhat of a uniform, try to get away from wedge-shaped pastures to where you're using 10 posts one day and then 5 posts the next or something like that. Is something to consider, because remember, we're not managing for space, we're managing for time when it comes to rotational grazing. And so that might help in, figuring out how many posts you need to carry and how many you need to plan for when setting up your temporary fences. Okay.
Galen, just a short time here, so let's just hit on the Energizers, because that's the other big component. I mean, building the fence is the one aspect, and there's a lot of different types of materials when it comes to building permanent or portable fencing. So let's talk then now about Energizers, and just generally speaking, we can really get kind of caught up in a lot of that stuff, but let's just kind of break this down simplistically for listeners on Energizers.
Yeah, that's a huge topic, Energizers. One is getting the appropriate sizing for the fence that you're installing. A great rule of thumb, the conservative way, and basically a foolproof way of sizing your fence, is to go 1 mile of linear fence per 1 joule output. So if you look at Energizers, they have two different ratings if you actually go and look at the fine print. The fine print is really what you want to pay attention to. Don't pay attention to the big flashy numbers on the front of the Energizer that says 100 miles or, 1,000 acres or something like that. You want to look at joule output because those numbers are unrealistic. They're figuring more closely to 10 miles of fence per 1 joule output. And that's really not feasible. It doesn't say that if you hook up that amount of fence to that Energizer, more than likely you will have it will register that the fence has some voltage on it, but it's not going to be enough to contain an animal. So going back to a good rule of thumb, just 1 mile of fence to 1 joule output. The other way that they're rated is through stored joules. We always want to measure off output. Then once we have the amount of fence that we are eventually going to, we don't want to necessarily go off of what we have today, but what we're going to grow into. And then we also want to consider the area, the type of soil that we have for max ground return, and where we are. If you're in the West, then you might want to consider a hot wire, ground wire setup. So that's actually a 2-wire fence where the wire is hot, usually the top wire, and then the lower wire is a ground wire. And that serves as an above ground return for the whole circuit. If an animal touches both of those wires, then it's going to get much stronger shock than if it was on a 1 wire and poor ground return because the soil is dry. The grounding is as important as sizing your Energizer, because you can buy the biggest Energizer in the world, and if you don't have a proper ground system, meaning you don't have, say, galvanized as long as you can possibly get in the ground rods, preferably anywhere from like a 6 to an 8 footer, where that's feasible, that's what we would prefer. Don't use rebar, don't use rusty fence posts, and then always test your current setup. So even if you hook up, your galvanized ground rods and you're not getting the type of voltage that you would expect, there's a couple different ways that you can go about improving your situation. One is if you have a fault finder or voltmeter. A fault finder is a tool that we use to measure the amount of energy lost on a fence. And it also includes a function within it measuring out the volts. And so SpeedRite and Gallagher, they both have these fault finder voltmeter handheld tools that you can use to measure your fence's output. And kind of rewind here, if there is an essential tool that the grazer needs in his back pocket, it is a voltmeter. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure that your fence is working every single day. And, it's pretty easy to take it for granted after years and decades of doing this, that the cattle respect the fence and that they're not getting out. But all it takes is one time for that fence to be down. You haven't checked it for a week, and then you have bulls on the other side of the fence and there's a problem. It happens. And so keeping a voltmeter and just staying on that is highly important. But going back to figuring out how to improve your ground, rods are spaced at least 10 feet apart and connected all with a clean galvanized wire. You can use the same type of wire that you built your fence with, that 12.5 gauge wire, and that they are touching. You can use the brass ground rod clamps, or you could use a galvanized or stainless steel hose clamp that tightly clamps the wire to the ground rod, and just add in as many ground rods spaced 10 feet apart as it takes to get your fence up to an acceptable voltage. Acceptable for me would be anywhere from, on the low end, 6,000. I preferred, up to 10,000. That's what we typically see out of our Energizers. There are some Energizers that will run higher than that, but with the lines that we use, primarily the SpeedRite Energizers, they are usually maxing out about 10,000 volts.
Mm-hmm. Well, Galen, unfortunately, I totally underestimated the fact that we could probably talk even for a whole nother show about some of the things we didn't even get into, that when it comes to constructing permanent and portable electric fence. We yet to really even talk about gates and gate handles and building those economically, in addition to winding up wire rollers for portable fencing needs and things like that, and just various other elements and nuances that come into building electric fence. And I know, folks, you probably have more questions. I hope we've at least got through a few things. If it's something that we would need to bring Galen back in and talk about some specific things, please let me know. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com, and we can bring Galen back in and hit on some specific topics. In the meantime, though, if you would like to reach out, touch base with Galen or any of the folks there at the American Grazing Lands Services, feel free to do that. And Galen, thanks for joining us here. Real quick, give folks information on how they can get a hold of you guys should they have more questions.
So you can call our office at 208-812-4123 or email us at americangrazinglands@gmail.com. Lands is plural. Or email me direct at galen@americangrazinglands.com.
Okay. All right. Well, Galen, thanks for joining us here today on the program.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Galen Gerrish has been our guest here today, talking on some of the elements that goes into building permanent and portable electric fence. I know, as I said just moments ago, we did not get through everything. And if you have a desire for us to do another show on that and specific things you would like us to cover, please do not hesitate at all to send me an email or give me a call and let me know on that. Well, stay with us. When we come back, meteorologist Don Day is in with a look at our long-term weather, and coming out of the break will be the Captain Tim O'Byrne with this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. I hope your summer haying and turnout and everything's going good. Love to see your Friday posts. Every Friday, that's my favorite day of the week, when I get to pester you folks to fill me in on what's going on out there in cow country, and you follow through outstandingly every single week. We've been doing that for about 10 years now, right, Justin? All right, today's news. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association confirmed that efforts to prevent ultra-processed lab-grown protein from showing up in the diet of the American Armed Forces were successful, following news that the U.S. Department of Defense is not pursuing lab-grown protein projects for human consumption. Well, as the father of a combat veteran Marine, I say, hurrah for that. Here's a quote from NCBA President and Wyoming rancher Mark Isley. NCBA was the first and only cattle group to uncover this stream of DoD funding that could go toward lab-grown protein projects, and we were the first and only group to fight back. After weeks of engaging with Congress and speaking out against this plan, we are thrilled to have DoD confirmation that lab-grown protein is not on the menu for our nation's amazing service members. I put the amazing part in there. These men and women make the greatest sacrifices every day in service to our country, and they deserve high-quality, nutritious, and wholesome food like real beef grown by American farmers and ranchers. Cue the flag and the great music. Thank you so much for that, you guys, for doing that. Little things like that, they fall through the cracks. Next thing you know, they're embedded in what's expected, and it's hard enough to root them out early. It's really hard to root something out like that after they've been there for a while. So, good job, NCBA. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain. And, it was just a little over a week ago when my wife and I drove across South Dakota to drop our son off, who enlisted in the Army. He's now down in Fort Sill and doing basic training down there. And so on behalf of all of us as parents of enlisted young men and women, we appreciate the efforts there by the NCBA on making sure that these kids are getting real beef products, not a knockoff. So with that, let's take a look at our long-term weather. Joining us as he does each and every week is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, I hate to sound like a broken record, as I just feel like for about the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've kind of just been doing the same thing. And I just, as I mentioned, kind of a rinse and repeat. But I think one of the things that's sort of nice with this, even though it's been dry for a lot of us, we are seeing some showers potentially, or that potential of that every 4 to 5 days. And specifically, as I know you had talked about last week in your podcast, boy, the fires that we're seeing the smoke of up in Western Canada, there's some moisture this weekend they might be getting.
Yeah, in fact, there has been recently some rain of parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta and even parts of British Columbia. And hopefully the pattern there is going to be more favorable to mitigate those fires as opposed to getting them started. Now, part of that big heat dome that we had just after the 4th of July was really the impetus to get a lot of fires started, because we had what we call a lot of dry lightning, where you get thunderstorms that don't produce much rain, but can cause lots of problems, especially in the wilderness areas where it's just hard to get to some of those fires. And so that is a pattern that we're hoping will ease a bit, and I think we will. We do continue to see surges of subtropical moisture. To your point, about every 4 or 5 days or so, moisture will cycle through, bringing showers and storms. So you are right. We still have some very dry areas, but at the same time, occasionally these thunderstorms come through and bring relief.
Mm-hmm. As we have talked about, we've been in this kind of rinse and repeat pattern here for the last 3 weeks or so. At any point do you see down the road, are we going to start to break out of that and maybe look, dare I say, more into some fall activity?
Not yet. Usually when we start to see things change is after that third full week of August. So we've got basically another 3 or 4 weeks of this current pattern we're in, where there's not going to be any earth-shattering changes to the pattern. The wild card is going to be tropical activity. Now, after Hurricane Beryl, we haven't really seen much of anything. But I think as we get into the month of August, we'll start to see tropical storm, hurricane talk coming back to the Gulf of Mexico along the southeast coast of the United States. And that'll be something that could affect and alter weather patterns. But right now, that rinse and repeat, well, that's going to go on here for a bit longer.
Well, you can tell I'm not impatient about seeing some cooler weather, can you?
I know. Careful what you ask for.
I know. I say that hesitantly because I know that in about 6 months, I'm going to be thinking, now, what was I thinking?
6? What do you mean? 3 months from now?
Well, it could be. You're right. Yeah, by October for sure. So, all right, Don, appreciate the update. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
All right. And you can catch meteorologist Don Day each and every morning through his daily video podcast by going to his website at dayweather.com. You can find a link right there to his YouTube channel. Also, if you're looking for weather instruments, rain gauges, things like that, you can find links to some of the ones that he suggests there through his website as well. Stay with us. When we come back, I'll tell you what we're going to be talking about on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, I had a listener out of Texas send me an email. He works for a fairly prominent feed company here in the United States. And he said, I work with a lot of ranchers and have been noticing an uptick in them buying feed wagons for making total mixed rations. But he said most don't know very much about that. And he said he'd like to discuss that topic and want to know if I was interested. And I said, absolutely. I realize we're in the heat of summer, but we're going to be looking at placing and putting in feed for winter use and how that's going to work and how we could utilize. That's an option out there that some folks are looking at and using these feed wagons. And so I think it'd be a great topic. That'll be on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. A thank you to our sponsors today, K-Line Irrigation, the American Gelvy Association, Hall & Hall, Cowpuncher Coffee, and Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.